Okay, this is part 1, chapter 1 of Culture of the Cave Beasts. And in this video, we're going to be analyzing all of the animating aspects of spiritual experience. All of the animating aspects of spiritual experience that I think can be tangibly substantiated ontologically. What I'm going to be providing to do that is speculative evidence that points towards a procedural speciation event for post-material culture. So if you're interested in having a one-sided conversation on the natural theology of Paleolithic Eurasia, and by extension, a re-examination of human evolution and psychic phenomena overall, watch this video, listen to this video, share this video with anyone you think might be interested. Because this is more or less from something that I've written, I have a little hypothetical introduction that's going to work as the primary idea and the conclusion of the entire video. It's going to wrap around and sort of answer itself as time goes on. So keep in mind, this was meant to be read and not listened to, but I'll do whatever I can to make it work. And with that being said, the hypothetical scenario is going to start with just one question. And that one question is, do pine trees even die?
Who sings thus? A human? A bird? A spirit?
This pine tree that was beneath me was oh so comparable to the countless conifers around me that in a sudden moment of connected clarity I was able to realize all of its identity was tantamount to its continuation. Shortly after this post-pine realization, all of existence ceased to exist altogether. I couldn't see reality as something understood explicitly at all anymore, because materiality had become an implicit outline, where existence wasn't quantified by any immediate or obvious quality of objects, but the immaterial interplay that exists between and beyond them. I entirely made that up. But fabricated experiences, I think, can still be worth something, worth at least an introduction or an idea to start with anyway. So, despite this sudden experience towards immateriality losing almost all of its momentum before we even got started, we still have time for the deduction of nature and its synthesis of spiritual phenomena, which is more important. So, with no consolation for either of us, I'll just move on with the point of the video. And I would have assumed you were reading this on a computer or tablet when I wrote it down, but since you're probably listening to this while doing something else entirely, I want you to take time out of whatever it is you're doing and just stare at the screen for a moment, or just shine a flashlight into your eyes or something like that for the sake of continuity, because whereas you and I are both staring into an illuminated plasmatic prism, and while the subcontextual property between material and all of its stimulation was probably lost on us after watching anime for the first time anyway, regardless, we still have to admit that our light up keyboards and skepticism can't and won't accurately model psychic phenomena. There are likely dimensions to our physical existence, like exemplified in the introduction, for example, that we are more or less estranged from now due to our interpretive tools of phenomena being so tightly integrated within our culture. Technology and all of its computational devices intended to make computational thinking even easier are, in essence, really just devices to support an interpretive model for consciousness that is a rough imitation of model processing, of cognitive model processing that we borrowed from someone else anyway. And I say that because modern consciousness, our consciousness, is almost entirely constituted by the cultivation and culture of just one anomalous human subspecies. One anomalous human subspecies that itself, well over 500,000 years ago, developed into entirely unforeseen dimensions of being both in general and of our own physical being as a species. For this subspecies, maintaining an interpersonal network with every animating force behind every corporeal body and the non-corporeal entities residing both within and without them was just an intuitive sort of thing. And that was true for us too when we were closer to this subspecies, but the ungrounded development of their technology has mutated us, with us, and even by us, causing us to become something different than them, something that is unable to really understand the point or the purpose of the complex data found in and beyond the technology itself. The introduction is how I would have imagined we once perceived of ourselves in relation to all of the energetic appeals of nature that we call spiritual. And when it came to the conscious cultivation of that living, breathing continuum that we're calling nature and spirit, that's the extemporaneous attribute defining this subspecies culture, our culture, that I'm really interested in examining in this video. And who knows, maybe we're still on the leftover culture of this subspecies cultivation, but just too electromagnetically divergent to really understand their premise, almost as if the tools and techniques utilized by this elusively aforementioned subspecies are running away from us to the point in which we're lost. Which to me makes sense because tools and techniques do have an agency of their own. And the sort of relationship between technology and us, and in particular, this subspecies, is something that I'd like to preface in the next part of the video, which is going to be tools and their teleology. Okay, this is chapter 2, part 1, tools and their teleology. Tools and social techniques develop outside of our physical limits the more that we utilize them, the more that we need them, and as we become more dependent on them, their initial instantiation and application changes for us physically, spiritually, psychologically, and socially. Really, everything about our being in the world changes with the utilization of technology. And that's because whatever fissure into the nexus of all creation that our relationship with material nature has is eventually going to be decimalized by our subservience to its technical development into the ultra-dimensional world of its pure mathematical form. It's through processing and refining material culture that we inevitably make binary machines out of the externalities that were previously unified in the development of our innate sense of a shared being. And by processing material nature to fit the technical development of societal standards, anything can feasibly be reduced to its production of a certain industrial end. And within technocentric cultures, such as those that this subspecies first produced, such as ours, trees will eventually be unplugged from the mycelium. Bees are going to eventually be kept in their keeps, and their involvement as an aspect of everything in between is one day no longer sensed or even seen. And this aspect of technology's effect has been a gradual process since the middle of the Paleolithic. But I don't want to ruin the suspense or mystery by clarifying that in any way. I'll just say that technology is the definitive trademark of modern consciousness, or at least part of the brand deal. But modernization really just means altering the status quo at the end of the day. And while the entire genus Homo is subject to the mimetic modernization of technology, some spes- bleh, some subspecies are subject to it more than others. And the implications of this are less than immediately obvious and the entire point of this video. Again, I'm keeping the suspense, but you probably know what or who I'm getting at. We, as an entire species, do seem to have an inherently irrational, maybe even almost paradoxical relationship with nature that's embedded within our bipedal dexterous development. And the greater a subspecies' proclivity towards abstraction, the more likely they are to find that out. Technosocial development is ultimately an atomizing process. It's ultimately an atomizing process where material reality and all of its contents are taken apart and scrutinized, only to then be reconfigured back into the morphological process of our evolutionary process by the way of our culture's tools, its trades, and its techniques. But, and this is a big but, technology's anomalous symbiotic development also creates an expansive reification of human spectrality. And paradoxically, the renunciation of spiritual first cause as well, which, as I'm going to try to demonstrate in the video, was the primary motivation of this subspecies culture. The primary motivation of the subspecies culture, and maybe even of the subspecies, was to expand upon the metaphysical premise by whatever means necessary or available to them, be that technological, psychological, artistic, all three of those combining, really whatever. That's going to be that's the point of the video. Technology isn't, and it's never been impartial. It relies on a coaction of logical designs to even spark evolutionary changes in an organism in the first place, which is a little bit Homo Heideggerian, but that's an influence. And while the idea of objective inhuman intentionality behind social gravity might not compute to those of us within it anymore, aspects of this culture do still exist in the ever present way that any inculcated organism can, but I'm saying too much. I'm saying too much too soon. What's crucial before explaining any of that is explaining what I believe to be the ecological endowment of intellectualization and how the ecological endowment of intellectualization frames the developmental dynamics that are intrinsic to our conception of spiritual being, or more so, what underlies our physical becoming. What consequence this culture and the development of the subspecies that created it has should be predicated by an approximation of spiritual substance first, starting with an approximation of the physiology underlying any psychological connection between the subspecies, the trees, and then everything in between. Talking with trees isn't normal. Talking with trees is paranormal. So, what's an ecological explanation for paranormal experience then? How do non local paranormal images and entities manifest in the first place? How do things like spirits, specters, sprites, or fairies manifest for us in nature? Where do they come from? How did they come from? And why did they first occur? First, I would say that these entities and images don't occur arbitrarily or that they're not real in a strict sense. Then, to answer for the purpose and emergence of them, I would say that spirits manifest for us like they do for any other organism through our psychic interpretations of the environment's interconversion of all of the primary ecological principles, forms, and energies that sustain and develop us anatomically. I think that's true for us, and it's probably true for every other organism, but for the fidelity in which they have to understand or interpret that varies because the anatomy used for perceiving our small spectrum of reality, our eyes, ears, mouth, fingers, whatever else, are limited to their necessities of acquisitional trajectories because evolutionary model processing needs an exchange of physical energy to identify purpose in the first place, always. which is why our various sensory systems and our intertangled developing cognition therein is predominantly shaped by acquisition and propagation. The perspectival consequence of cognition having been predicated by false oppositions and competition is that nervous systems, us included, have evolved and adapted to interface with phenomena via sense data that is in some part predicated by an illusory consumption of oppositions. But in reality, all things are in a flux, and this flux is subject to a unifying measure or rational principle, and sufficient conceptual complexity exhibited in more advanced nervous systems, us included, typically entrains to the omnistic principle, call it spirit, and see it in nature. And while integration is our ultimate state of transcendence, the kinetic principle of oppositions does serve a vital role in nature nonetheless. It establishes an ecological network of interdependence that endears every organism into a universal framework for seeking the aforementioned dispensation of energy, even if they're unaware of it. And when energy is sustainably sought by everything within the biosphere, all the multiplicitous probabilities within any given environment are inevitably integrated evolutionarily into tight ecological niches. And when everything and everyone is subordinated under these ecological pretenses, they inadvertently form an interdependent equilibrium of evolving and diversifying referent information that all reflect the initial energy dispensation of the singularity or spirit. And the more complex the operations of any given system are, the better. So, spirit is just the way in which aspects of being that are too complex for us to experience with our senses are introspectively expressed in a litany of different ways, but expressed nonetheless. And this deduction, or maybe reduction, of what spiritual experience is explains spirituality for me because deep down, consistent paranormal connections and observations made throughout differentiated cultures and time do express that reality contains much more than we can immediately explain, and they all express it in a similar but not the same way. And sure, any expression of this vague truth is considered animism by most anthropologists, but animism, religion in the rawest form possible, is essentially just an extrapersonal communication with nature. And this type of communication, via various psychological means with some roughly mapped extra dimensional substrate wherein everything immediately existent is in a coactive assemblage of becoming, is an animate experience and conclusion that's so ubiquitous it's universally presupposed, and what I tried to encapsulate with the introduction. And I think that there is a physiological underlying to this that I want to cover in the next chapter, which is going to be chapter 2 of part 1, and it's going to be titled Supernaturalism. So, this psychospiritual phenomena that's inherent to our place in nature can formally be encapsulated anatomically, rationally, within a metabolic flux of mutually assured affirmations. And what I mean by that is whatever modality that an organism might adopt within its environment, it fundamentally embodies the same catalysts that comprise the observer. And so, within an ontological process of deducing familial traits within the environment, so shared by the observer, energetic relationships between emerging organisms are eventually interfacially reciprocated. They're interfacially reciprocated to the point that more complex nervous systems develop an almost quasi paranormal sense of the unseen aspects of both themselves and their environment. That is then going to be expressed through their culture. But what exactly is that which is being expressed in their culture? Well, the ecological dynamics that are inherent to spiritual phenomena are mainly taking place within a microscopic sort of world. But from some points of perspective, simpler microscopic worlds are really even more substantially real than we are as individuals. For example, the human body comprises more foreign microbial life than that of its own eukaryotic existence, and humans, including their microbes, only exist in conjunction with one another out of this sort of situation in the first place. So it's deep, dark, and primordial places of our own microbiological origin, like those in and around hydrothermal vents billions of years ago, or within your own belly button right now, that work as rough material templates that we can scale ecological phenomenology up and up and up from simpler micrology to advanced metacognitive systems of microorganisms such as ourselves in order to see where and how immaterial complexity begins to affect our process for intellect or spiritual existence, which really the ambiguity between intellect as a pattern of dispensation and energy and as a living entity might just be what all living things really are. And while the specific spaces, scenes, or scenarios described might be theoretical models for real world non spatial effects, their biological principles and metaphysical connotations still apply to our ultrasensory systems of perception. It just takes a lot of extrapolation from these explanations to get to psychospirituality, animism, culture, religion, or wherever we are in the video or wherever we are just in general. Because within any ecological niche, the metabolic structures that any given animal, person, or even paramecium within that niche utilizes to render its version of its reality are going to eventually encounter and induce all the divergent stimuli within their environment. And when they induce that divergent stimuli, they will eventually evolve and modify their pre existing anatomy, structures, and models to interpret what was previously divergent or to them maybe even supernatural. And thinking of the supernatural along these sort of biotic terms substantiates it as something feasible, in my opinion, something that has a basis in emergence. But me and my opinion is still totally incoherent. It's totally incoherent and subject to powers that are superseding my own, regardless of what I might think, because between it all, collecting and identifying raw pieces of otherworldly designs from within the complex systems inhabited in this continual pre-conscious connection to all of the unmanifest vectors of physical being to eventually become is my best description of what non-physical entities, physical organisms, and their subjective identities therein actually represent. And within the flux of all interconnected existence like this, under a sort of anatomical understanding of spirit, our sense of self isn't really any more distinguishably real compared to the ghosts and geists that psychosomatically emerge to better understand ourselves in the yet to be uncovered space and time continuum we exist within. This addendum to the definition of what substantiates an identity as something tangibly real comes from the inability to apply finite time to any actual identification of the infinite principles that are underlying identifiers themselves. That is just too abstract. Instead, we're, and by we, I mean all living things within the biosphere, are ultimately beholden to indirect ancillary aspects of our own morphology that only manifest externally in recurrent ecological forms in order to even attempt to understand ourselves subjectively, much less the objective reality of whatever came before us. With all of this considered, we can say pretty accurately that our tendency towards anthropomorphizing things in or around us isn't some arbitrary bias to apply human agency to complexity, but instead for complexity itself to express itself in our cultural machinations. So, all of the imaginal sounds, sensations, and images that seemingly come from non physical modalities through spiritual experience really are occurring from simpler micrological structures that are emerging to create greater systems of complexity themselves, only becoming anthropomorphic because communication between smaller systems is what makes complex organisms in the first place. Metaphysical reality is basically ecological agency speaking up for itself, and in that, we don't anthropomorphize things subjectively, but whatever non local principle that dictates telligibility and intellectualization is what makes the anthropomorphs in the first place. And for that reason, I think it's safe to say that any form of taxonological identification that we utilize is more or less reducible to the accumulation of associations that we have with the interconnected biotic principles motivating our indirect instinct of the not so natural occurrences within the environment. The takeaway, as it relates to this video anyway, is that all of the aspects of material and its identification is ultimately reducible to stimulatory effects that themselves rely on our extrapolation of an object's context. And I say context and not content necessarily because depending on how we interpret whatever the object might be, changes its and our material nature. And this ability to perceive pre-spatial immaterial domains within the spatial material reality around us through the spiritual experiences evoked therein is the nexus between energy and entropy actualized in the capacity for species-specific logic, aesthetics, music, magic, all of which culminate as the defining characteristics of the conscious process of being and becoming shown in our culture. And guess what? There was a specific subspecies, the very same subspecies I have yet to name or define in this video, that really was responsible for refining this transcendental aspect of culture through the means of their technology and techniques. Within the process of this subspecies' cultural cultivation, their inborn instincts, inclinations, and subsequent behaviors were more or less interpreted to correspond with unique external spirits of reoccurring emergence that characterized the coaction between stimuli endearing those instinctual responses and their cultural concept for transitory non-local identities therein. And whenever they were culturally applicable, these identities were expressed by this culture through the proliferation of elaborate intersocial motifs in the form of artistic socio-spiritual schemas or dialectically in mental maps of behavioral entrainment. And while these conditions to culture pervade the animal kingdom more or less, the fidelity with which culture like this is realized morphologically stands alone in time and place amongst this one still yet mentioned subspecies. And I'm hesitant to call this subspecies process religion instead of mental maps or whatever else due to it taking a less codified approach in this theory. Which isn't to say psychospiritual processes inherent to this subspecies were some sort of live, laugh, love platitude in prior states of practice, but that their conception was more of a Paleoplatonism instead of a Stone Age Sharia, if that makes sense. Regardless, I think that these primordial forms of identification within and between nature and the collective psychosocial schemata were individually allocated and expressed appropriately to their in-group utility for self-actualization in the concordant works, songs, and symbols of the group, regardless of codification or control within this subspecies' approximate cultures. Because I think they would have had the awareness that morphocultural development is more like an impressionable energetic field extending from probabilities within the ecology that can only be approximated between the social application of supernatural powers that are latent in their external designs and the augmentation of physical being. And without this subspecies' unique capacity to render external forms into their physical being via the complexity of cognition, of their cognition, that was tangibly seen in their tools, trades, and techniques, The full enunciation would be impossible. Their space within the greater physiomorphic field, and consequently their physical body, would have lost all control or confinement by loss of conscious containment within the so far unseen space-time continuum, which is the evolutionary necessity for abstraction and the emergence of culture itself, to contain that. So the people of this culture worked with great accommodation to appropriate interconversions of psychic energy at large, and what technocultural traditions remain today by way of their art and accessories are just refractions of their full supernatural reality. But before definitively addressing the who or what of this culture and what that really means, I want to compare their metaphysical format to something more contemporary to us. One important aspect of their metaphysical methodology, I think, is seen in the Pacific Island cargo cults of today, where in the presentation of incomprehensibly vast technic data, the island animists simply incorporate the accompanying stimulation into their spiritual worldview overall. Because in their supernatural reality, there is no such thing as religion or anything past physics, even for that matter. They intuitively know to interpret technology and all of its stimulatory effects as an entity with its own identity and interests, which makes sense because nobody would conceptualize an existence separating the spiritual from the secular, knowing what latent morphological capacity concepts, objects, signs, sigils, whatever have, regardless of our arbitrary definitions. And abstraction in this way was and remains an art form for retrieving the latent quasi physical identities from out of the unknown spaces of material matter. However, the first human subspecies, the first human subspecies to create abstract art wasn't Homo sapien. I'm not even going to give this chapter a number because it's not really even a chapter, and I think I've already given up on numbering chapters or including everything that was from the written book in the first place. So it's just the conclusion. And for that reason, we'll just call it the second half.
And everywhere I go, there's always something to remind me of another place.
I think that we can take all of the art, culture, and technology that's been accumulated since the beginning of civilization from all the various small groups of post-Paleolithic Eurasian populations back to one Paleolithic subspecies and their mystically oriented culture. And sure, the emergence of post-material culture is assumed to be ubiquitously human, but the question of how and where humanity even came to be human is pretty unsettled. And what I'm going to be proposing in this video is that the extent of post-material technoculture is both derived from isolated cognitive designs particular to just one supposedly extinct subspecies, and that the development of it is what made us human. Because during this subspecies' drastic evolutionary development through insurmountable and ever changing environments, they accumulated an unusually high mutational load that delimited their security within the natural world, which set them against nature, opening the necessity for an active inquiry into the supernatural world of abstraction by means of their developing conceptual survival devices in ways that had really never ever been done before. And that's the emergent formula for meta anything, really. This is the evolutionary trajectory, this subspecies, this is the biggest single component to culture. I will say, though, what assemblage of attributes were needed to induce the internalization of external forms was admittedly human overall, but, and this is a big but, abstract complexity at the meta level and post-material world thereafter was entirely Homo Neanderthal in nature. That's the big reveal. The developed world is Neanderthal adjacent, but when you add it all together, their part to play in both our anatomy and the evolutionary process lays the groundwork for sufficiently advanced abstraction. Consider Neanderthalensis emerged within an unusually harsh ecology when compared to other hominids. So, the external, leading to intersocial selection pressures, would sort of inadvertently cultivate an organism with an almost paranormal cognitive capacity for abstraction. So, what really goes into the formation of a shared mind or culture in the first place? And how does that intersect with early Eurasian hominization? Well, collecting raw external data and corroborating said points of inference into directive mental models is an interdependent process. An interdependent process where an organism ultimately models itself within the overreaching cosmic process based on ecologically viable system functions, like sort of explained in the first part of the video. Whichever sensory organs or systems are necessary for energy acquisition will then modulate the continuation of said function and eventually their sense of reality itself. With that in mind, we know that Neanderthalensis and their culture was underpinned by a necessity for advanced levels of abstraction due to their difficult expansion into the demanding environment of Greater Eurasia and the subsequent need for new and improved tools, textiles, and survival strategies that come with that. So, the social application for the selection of cognitive traits needed to manufacture such utilities would, of course, manifest fetishistically in the tools and techniques of their culture. And secondary supersystems like Neanderthalensis as a subspecies and Neanderthal agnate culture used in this context contain a multitude of smaller systems and multiplicitous biological process functions underpinning those smaller systems themselves. This is why the developmental dynamics that are intrinsic to any organism are ontologically inseparable from the psychosocial models of cultivation employed, be that discrete autonomous metabolic functions, phenotypic selection, differential eusociality, adaptive pathology, intrasocial selection, intersocial selection, intersexual selection, fast or slow sexual strategies, shared reaction patterns, patterns of emotional recall, psychospiritual abstraction patterns, sets of similar emotional depth, artistic tendencies, all of that. In one way or another, these morphological effects are going to surface culturally. And with everything so far considered and following our subsequent evaluation of the bioanthropological record, the ascertainable attributes of Homo neanderthalensis and their culture seriously call the standard trajectory of spiritual awareness into question. The hypothetical evidence I've amassed so far for this points towards a procedural, technique-specific speciation event that focuses on Neanderthalensis and Eurasian expansion for post-material culture and even higher consciousness as a whole, because archaeological along with psychoanatomical evidence correlates with genetics to show an evidential change in human consciousness roughly upon the introduction of early Mousterian Neanderthal culture to that of the intermediate Aurignacian interbreeding events. But I'll add more on the specificities of that later. For now, I'm going to keep the show rolling and we're going to move on to elaborating on Neanderthalensis as a whole.
If you're waking up and wondering why you don't feel so good, that's because you're living in a capitalist world and you're an animal.
So, what do we know about Neanderthal encephalization? Well, we know that their cranial capacity was significantly larger at approximately 1600 cc than modern people, 1400 cc approximate, and most significantly, that their cerebellum was much larger than relatively modern Cro-Magnon type people. And considering that primitive culture is generated through dreamlike states of consciousness, in which multiform data is understood through liminal states of consciousness, like hypnagogia or in hallucinations, trances, and dreams, and all such states are rendered primarily via the cerebellum, The theurgic creation of gods through the face of culture, and in particular Neanderthal culture, is and should be denoted to Neanderthal-derived adaptations in subsequent subspecies. Leading from what culture is more generally, we're going to go on to Neanderthal culture more specifically. And Neanderthalensis was the first human subspecies that was really capable of significantly extracting immaterial ideation out of the piecemeal material formulas that they created due to their uniquely intimate relationship with complex tools of abstraction. And I'll go over more of the archaeological, material, and anatomical inclusion of Neanderthalensis in modern Eurasian populations to substantiate that claim later in the video. But to expand on what I think the function of their culture really was, their evolutionary particularities really kind of lent them to an intertwined ability to consistently extract encoded data from the manipulation of the static principles and probabilities within their ecology. Creative designs of a culture are fundamentally expressions of the coactive dialectical mediumship imposed upon an individual from within their ecology by and through their peers, past and present, and also from their own mutations and anomalies as well, which are all working together to modulate the species' greater metacognitive capacity through the individual's expression of all of that. So, whenever applicable, personal and cultural expressions fitting latent cognitive designs are kind of brought to mind or brought to cause. And this human capacity to even realize aspects of greater complexity is driven by the same artistic techniques responsible for the emergence of, of the human species itself. And by finding all of the metaphysical ideations like these that substantiate our material culture, we can take aspects of endeared behavior and draw them back to their biological conclusions. And these conclusions about humanity's being and becoming a spirit go really deep into prehistory. And so deep, well, very deep into prehistory, but most importantly to Neanderthalensis. And that's going to be the next chapter of part 2. The Neanderthal culture and its interconnected customs are as pervasive in extant culture as they are ancient, with the various cultural traditions, models, and myths of European antiquity relating to just one contributing factor, and that's Homo neanderthalensis. I think Neanderthalensis probably had a bigger impact on global culture than Indo-European expansions, Christianity, colonial rule, or even the Industrial Revolution. But to cross that bridge, we need to start from the beginning. And in order to do that, we're going to abbreviate some 3 or 4 million years of human evolution real quick, hopefully getting a more accurate anatomical account of that one contributing factor to our culture, Neanderthals. This is what I consider to be a more honest appraisal of the human evolutionary timeline than is typically taught. And for that reason, I would like to preface with the acknowledgement that the following information is more or less interpretive. And while everything in this has been scrutinized, legitimized, and re-referenced by secondary sources, there may be some information that is less than verifiable. But conjecture and guesswork is typically more often the case than is admitted by anthropologists anyway. So, despite that explanation, I want you to research this on your own as well and come to your own conclusions and comment those conclusions that you come to. With that being said, it's time for the best part of the video, and the best part of the video is my wife's illustrations. This title or this part of this portion is going to be titled Painted by Migration. We'll start the timeline and breakdown at the beginning with Homo erectus. Homo erectus was a subspecies of archaic Homo with a living record 2 to 1.8 million years into the past, living throughout the Pleistocene in and around what is today continental Africa. Within the rough conglomeration of early Homo erectus, however, some especially intrepid individuals decided to divert from their in-group and leave their native continent of Africa, moving into the inhospitable landscape that was Eurasia. Two groups of the same species would then diverge some 600,000 to a million years ago to undergo two unique evolutionary trajectories. Here is an interpretive visual of Homo erectus proper prior to the species' migratory event out of Africa some 1.6 million to 600,000 years ago. What is being shown now is Homo heidelbergensis. This is an estimation of the earliest iteration of speciation that began to take substantial phenotypic form in and around northern Anatolia in southern Europe, give or take geography, of course, some 800,000 to 300,000 years ago. Homo heidelbergensis would be an approximately southern European chronospecies of Homo erectus proper and progenital to later Neanderthalensis. Think of them as a post-erectus proto-Neanderthalensis. And last, but definitely least, we have Homo ergaster. And Homo ergaster is likely an amorphous African chronosubspecies of Homo erectus derived from bands of Homo erectus proper, interbreeding with even more archaic forms of the Homo genus in and around Africa some 1 million to 300,000 years ago, in between that. Mutations occurring at protein synthesis that are conducive to adaptive selective pressures are favored and become phenotypically expressive, whereas unneeded sequences sit dormant in the genomic graveyard of a species. Homo erectus experienced this bioengineering firsthand after venturing deep into what was, at the time, wild, untamed Eurasia, and their evolutionary trajectory into Eurasia would eventually lead to the development of Homo neanderthalensis, and Homo neanderthalensis would neuroanatomically kick off the metaphysical network underpinning conceptual culture as a whole. But Neanderthalensis didn't emerge out of a vacuum. There were various morphs, species, and subspecies with little to significant phenotypic distinction that branched off during or shortly after Homo erectus ventured out of Africa. The migratory groups of Homo erectus that went even deeper into Eurasia instead of backtracking back into Africa intermixed and absorbed with even older European hominids that we're really not all that familiar with, such as Homo georgicus, for one example. And it's interbreeding events like these in and around Eurasia and other disparate areas geographically from Africa between this Homo erectus migratory group and the species pre-existing throughout Eurasia that produced an even earlier iteration of Heidelbergensis that would populate coastal Europe some 1.2 million to 800,000 years ago, primarily in southern Spain, known as Homo antecessor. But what about Homo erectus populations that diverted back into Africa instead of continuing it deeper into Europe and Asia? Well, they would interbreed with a slew of other hominids as well, but most of these hominids were primitive equatorial hominids. We're talking species like Homo habilis or Paranthropus robustus in Boise. And all of this would combine with various Middle East and North African iterations of Homo erectus to create Homo ergaster. So Homo heidelbergensis might have initially evolved out of Africa, but the record also shows that Homo heidelbergensis would eventually rebreed their way back into Africa too, to sort of kickstart the evolution into the sapient line for this downward spiral that was going on with African erectus populations. This is presumably attributable to the rapid evolution of African Homo erectus populations into the earliest iterations of Homo sapiens. In some of those earliest iterations, like Homo helmi, for example. So, Homo heidelbergensis is accordingly the common ancestor to both Homo sapiens and Neanderthalensis for that reason. We can more or less break the evolutionary timeline down into an overly simplistic reference, just like this. Homo antecessor should be considered the earliest iteration of the post Homo erectus proto Homo neanderthalensis Eurasian phylogeny, whereas, and this is speculative, Homo ergaster should be thought of as the earliest of the proto Homo sapiens phylogeny. Because populations of Homo ergaster that were living in and around North Africa and the Middle East some million or so years after Homo erectus initially migrated out of Africa would eventually start to intermix with colonial Heidelbergensis populations. And the resulting offspring between these two groups would become what we think of as Homo sapiens sapiens or prototypic Homo sapien. This amorphous iteration of early admixed Homo sapien would eventually become the clade of African Homo sapiens that we all derive a portion of our ancestry from today. But in and around Europe, branches of that same erectus outgroup that had initially traveled and diversified throughout Eurasia oh so long ago would intermix with what was becoming Homo antecessor and continue to intermix and evolve isolated amongst themselves into what would become Homo heidelbergensis and then eventually into Homo neanderthalensis, which only some of us derive a portion of our ancestry from today. It's important to consider, too, that early Homo sapiens really show no anatomical or archaeological signs of cultural or cognitive modernity at these early evolutionary stages than other offshoots of Homo erectus do or did. Other offshoots, such as Homo neanderthalensis or even later Homo denisova. Really, in fact, the overwhelming evidence shows that key stages of cultural and cognitive development primarily occurred within the Eurasian phylogeny instead. So, in combination with the biotic synthesis for spiritual complexity underpinning post-material culture, where do Homo sapiens fit in that formula? When did they steal fire from the gods? Whatever catalysts invoked conceptions of higher consciousness acted upon the niche but growing Eurasian subspecies some 1 million years ago, and the proliferation of their experience remains prescient to this day. The same animating attributes can be traced within the cultural progression of both their traditions and their genetics in admixed populations, which predicate the continued creative procurement in which further metacognitive culture is even realized. And while the space-time continuum is always waiting to be explored and expanded, stepping into that metaphysical territory is really mostly attributable to the archaeoanatomical record of, you guessed it, Homo neanderthalensis. Neanderthalensis was really the first hominid with the cognitive capacity to devise sets of tools and techniques that allowed humanity to further pierce the veil in what was and would continue to be a global culture sympathetic to magic. A global culture sympathetic to magic that radiates around Eurasia and Neanderthal admixture, but with that being said, what is magic really? What does magic actually get constituted by? And more importantly, what was the personal and cultural experience of magic for Neanderthalensis? This isn't going to be an overlaid explanation to answer that question of scale phenomenology like in the beginning of the video. This portion will continue in multiple parts in an attempt to reimagine the Neanderthal perception and practice of ritual magic. With that out of the way, what was magic for Neanderthal man? Well, magic is just an emotive, anthropomorphic approximation underlying the not so physical continuum of interconnected manifestations that we fundamentally exist in. So, whatever modality ecological processes like the seasons, storms, and the consequent propagations of animals within that occupy within biological design, they correspondingly embody the same catalyst in which the observer's instincts in self is composed. And by deducing, deconstructing, and adapting elemental traits from within ecological design shared by the individual, gradients of encompassing consciousness are effectively reciprocated beyond any quantifiably physical limitations, depending on the capacity for creativity that an organism has. That is the basis for the entry to metaphysical reality, as far as I'm able to understand it anyway. So for Neanderthalensis in the Eurasian morphs after, what were felt but unforeseen spirits within the continuum of interconnected manifestations were temporospatially realized through the inception of artistic motifs, magic, and technology. And unlike in former subspecies, burial in the Neanderthal record seems to accompany the custodial reintegration of metaphysical being that exists just beyond space or time. Their physical quality had unseen qualia, and controls in complex systems were personified anthropomorphically as deities from the characteristics of complex biotic phenomena. Geographical locations they occupied seemed to begin to mirror celestial predetermination, and all of existence in between the two would be ordered by the process of totems and tools within each. Technique-specific psychostructural developments like these are essentially ritualized interpersonal relationships with nature. They're extrapersonal techniques that extend morphological resonance between the multiplicitous electromagnetic fields in which subjects and objects mirror. Morphological field dynamics underlying ecological emergence as an idea and as a sentence need some sort of further explanation, and I know that I said that this wouldn't be more scaled phenomenology as the video progresses, but I lied. So, the following concept and chapter underlying my attempt at an explanation of psychospiritual phenomena more broadly is going to be much further from deductive reasoning than I'm really comfortable or at all familiar with. But I want to try to explore the supernatural world in this video that Neanderthalensis inhabited as fully as I possibly can. So we're going to go back to before the emergence of first principles themselves and try and assess what these principles might have come from in the first place and how Neanderthalensis might have experienced them at different stages of their development. There has to be some sort of consistent, non-dimensional design that's influencing all of the dimensional structures and the consequent ecosystem that microbiological life emerges within. But getting to that place is going to get pretty strange. And for that reason, we're in the strangest part of the video now, trying to work out what the space-time continuum really even is fundamentally. And starting with the pre-existence of causal morphology is going to reduce our observation of it to inference alone. But I do think it's still possible to categorize some of the non-spatial abiotic systems affecting observable reality and material objects nonetheless. For example, we can start by looking deeper into the cause for corresponding occurrences of self-similarity found in observable nature itself. And it's generally true to say that, drawn to its limits, rigorous reductive ontology will lead us to an almost unobservable, maybe even animistic reinterpretation of physical nature, because emergent biotic systems are structured physiologically by predetermining mathematical principles that are underlying the fractal dispensation of energy, which is an immaterial, prebiotic, and aspatial geometric system of logic dictating material development. So I'd say from that, we've at least started to reach the immaterial world itself. But it's going to take a little more explanation to get past monodimensionality. We'll get there soon enough, though. We'll scale up or down or wherever we need to until we can piece non-dimensionality together. Um, Emergence, recursion, and self-similarity is a good eco-ontological starting point, or should come from an immaterial starting point at the very least. So let's focus on the natural laws before the emergence of consciousness itself. And one of those, for starters, would be the principle of self-similarity. It's one of the many observable and calculable mathematical motifs that is underlying all recursive references to the indivisible logic that's found within and without the biosphere. Preceding properties that are inherent to material structuring, like self-similarity, originate from some non-spatial dimension before and beyond the beginning of time. And despite their non locality or its non locality, we can deduce through experimentation that they ultimately shape, create, and control objects and organisms through ordered patterns of electromagnetic probabilities, which is really the brass tacks in terms of biology. Um, Cellular systems depend on these mathematical rules underlying their niche spectrum of electromagnetic phenomena to even construct whatever electrochemical patterns of system functions substantiate their morphological place within material dimensional reality. Without those or without their morphological constants, or the morphological constants that pervade the continuum of existence itself, there would be no substructure for anatomy to build upon. An organism's bioelectric patterns depend on its evolutionary apprehension of these non-spatial rules and regulations that predicate cellular structuring itself, which means the patterns of electromagnetic stimulation that an organism is subjected to determine the cultivation of its physiology, which eventually determines its neural response patterns as well. Within this bioelectric field of emergent structure processing, the simplest systems are going to seem root in response to a world of constraints and conditions, whereas the more advanced systems will interweave an advanced tapestry out of the phenomenal world around them. What is being done to impressionable sets of simpler cellular systems in the early micrological world was entirely structured by the chaotic integration of varying levels of probabilities. But the emergency of life in that chaotic world billions of years ago was just a collection of electromagnetic fields that, without knowing it at the time, would emerge to be mirrored neurophysically in ever more advancing and advanced bioelectrical systems. With coming events to human speciation, though, this would become an extremely refined neurological process that encapsulates all of the unearthly predetermining principles involved in the ecological intellectualization of creative development and awareness itself. It's through the creative abstraction of early to late Neanderthalensis that this sort of cognitive entrainment process within the underlying morphological substrate or space-time continuum would begin to develop neuroanatomically and be manipulated consciously through magic, technology, art, and more generally, their culture. And before you know it, you have two thumbs, tools extending from your arms like appendages, techniques and traditions surrounding these anomalies, and then comes the omnipresent awareness of animacy in of itself. And that is basically the philosophy of Homo Heidegger again. As an unwitting process, that applies to the entire genus Homo. However, conceptualizing and controlling our place within it was done through abstraction commensurate with Neanderthal technology, culture, and art. And I don't need to say which species was first in the archaeological record for doing all that abstraction stuff, but it was Neanderthalensis. And I'm going to get even more theoretical, though, and attempt to evaluate some of the more plausible experiences of parapsychological phenomena that I believe were intimate to Neanderthalensis and post-material culture. We're going to examine the methods or means necessary for things like remote viewing, the logistics involved in manifesting quasi-physical psychical properties like tulpas and egregores, tested and attributed experiences of past life regressions, reincarnation, a lot more. All of this will be examined by reason of three interconnected aspects involved in Neanderthals' perception of the paranormal. One, the holographic nature of space-time. Two, how bioelectric systems control and conduct energy. Three, the neural anatomical anomalies of Neanderthalensis. And that next chapter is going to start with the title Homo-Electromagnetic Man. Neanderthal culture was framed by controlling, manipulating, and understanding metaphysical resonance. Their parapsychological technique was fundamentally interwoven within their industrial, technical, and artistic culture. Creative techniques like cave art and rituals that were presupposed to be material in nature were actually initially outlets in which out-of-body experiences could effectively be contained and observed. So most, if not everything, in the technological and artistic culture of Neanderthalensis involved the conscious integration of static electromagnetic mediums back into the continuum itself, where at the say of a spell or through the invocation of the right senses, their entire conscious mind could resurface to the becoming state of material reality through the transfiguration of the right neural response patterns. And I think that we today would perceive this as an extrasensory modality, like possessing a mild telekinetic ability or remote viewing capabilities, for example, which makes sense to me because the primary creative capacity we have to realize and control the paranormal spectrum of reality is mostly left over from Neanderthal admixture anyway. Although, and it's kind of a caveat, I would say, though, that for premixed Neanderthalensis, these paranormal dimensions of reality were less abnormal or dysfunctional than they are for us, making them de facto less paranormal. So that's going to take some explanation. And I don't plan on you believing anything I'm about to say, really. But nonetheless, for the sake of everything that you've already listened to and the time that we've both wasted, I'm going somewhere schizophrenic. Or at least hopefully we'll go somewhere schizophrenic. We'll start with the nature of space-time and then move on to the possible models for multidimensional human consciousness from there. Um, let's say, and I've heard a lot of other people say this almost verbatim, but let's say that waking human consciousness is something that developed from and developed in some ways to function at a simpler two-dimensional binary level of a more complex non-binary multidimensional space-time. And in this simplified two-dimensional plane, the field of consciousness can decode and download whatever relevant encoded four-dimensional data is needed outside of its confined physicality without wasting any vital resources or energy. Thinking of it that way kind of explains why cellular systems entrain their bioelectric pathways to roughly match the electric frequencies in which external stimuli exists, because cellular systems couldn't perceive space outside of themselves if they didn't entrain to amorphous electromagnetic system structures. ECO-ontology already kind of explains this process in a holistic sort of way, but before positioning back into the prehistoric record, I want to have some non-local attempt to pragmatically map this supposed substrate from which ecological systems emerged in the first place. We've been developing an approach to the quantifiable existence of what is ultimately an immaterial world. But now I'm going to contradict that idea entirely. I'm going to contradict the idea of non-locality entirely and try to describe its qualities for the sake of a rational reconciliation, which is I, a full effort, but I want to leave every rock turned over. So, how would we even begin to describe the immaterial world, though, with no substantial material for reference? Well, without scaling up from observable emergent systems, without material to instantiate space itself, and without any map whatsoever, we would start with whatever we feel but can't actually see, and in conjunction with one another, there seems to be enough of an image for the immaterial in those kinds of transient things like complex ecological systems, mathematics, music, instincts, emotions, sensations, and experiences. All of these inexplicable qualities of nature surely have some practical outline we can attempt to shade, though. Uh, they don't exist outside of themselves. So we could explore the predetermining and amorphic mathematical qualities of nature more and work out something from there, maybe. Because I'm sure whatever value our transient sense of sensation and emotion has is shared by a universal system of logic too. So where would we go for the beginning of that? Um, let's start with thermodynamics. Leading us to a reduction of nature to a set of universal measures that are then traced back to the biggest of bangs. That's where thermodynamics gets us, to the Big Bang. And since all of material existence can be interconverted to this one single point in space and time, the Big Bang, it would then follow that our universe, as we experience it anyway, is probably unified in a way similar to the astrophysical phenomena found in a black hole. That would make sense. And the event horizon of a black hole is a two-dimensional space, and the entirety of its mass has an entropy equivalent to the area of that two-dimensional event horizon. At least I think so anyway, but this is a bit further afield than I'm comfortable with, but I wanna try to wrap everything up. So, if we take all of the subatomic particles in the world and then we smash them into a flat surface, a black hole, the event horizon of a black hole, that surface would contain every dimension of our four-dimensional universe. As astronomically observable phenomena, black holes would work to explain the fundamental property of space-time for that reason, and of course, that would include consciousness as something emerging within that space, which is why I'm bringing black holes up in the first place, for their implications. But what implications black holes have for quantum entanglement, and more importantly, how can quantum entanglement change our concept of consciousness and its relationship within the continuum of material existence itself? Um, well, if all of material reality can fit into a dimensional surface, which is something we see in black holes, and despite that, we're supposed to believe that the corresponding superpositions that electrons exist in are capable of acting upon each other instantaneously somehow, regardless of their distance, faster than the speed of light, breaking the theory of relativity. How does that happen? How that happens, well, it hasn't been explained. It hasn't been explained by any agreed upon model of interpretation. And this might be conjecture from a guy who can't count very high, but why would I, in the face of contradictory evidence, assume there to be substantial physical space in which subatomic particles are even communicating in at all? I question the idea of fixed dimensional space-time altogether, to be honest. Would it not make more sense to say that space-time isn't physically real as we understand it, but that it's fundamentally emergent from some ultra-dimensional substrate instead? And that when some subatomic wave functions collapse, that every codependent particle within the universe is collapsing back into the non-spatial substrate itself? Evidence suggests that. Um, as opposed to fixed structures inter between space and time, evidence suggests that every probability, object, and individual exists in some interdependent field, some interdependent non-material field. And that when all of these probabilities, objects, and organisms are collected, they create a three-dimensional image of depth from some unforeseen correspondence or substrate of electromagnetic varieties. This theoretical model for the phenomena of emergence in consciousness and all its contents really works just like a hologram, which is, I guess, what physicists like Susskind and other string theorists really meant when they say that the universe is a hologram or like a hologram. But that still leaves the question of where does consciousness really fit into that? Neurophysiological systems and their consciousness would be like little electromorphological structures. Little electromorphological structures of varying complexity that are all interconnected in the middle of this non-dimensional flux. And they're all tuning to the species-specific channels of electromagnetic reality from without of the space-time continuum to try to create a species-specific station within it. So I think that this was or is primarily instantiated anatomically in the microbiological world, where sensory systems are more or less conditioned by raw emitting electromagnetic fields in which reoccurring probabilities even emit from. And what these converging electromagnetic probabilities really are, or where they ultimately emerge from, could be internal, and by that, I don't necessarily mean at the individual level internally. I don't know if there even is the concept of an individual internal state within this ultimate reality. Because if we subdivide prior ideas to their conclusion, when Ernst Schrödinger used the quantum probability of radioactive decay to illustrate the indeterminacy of subatomic superpositioning, the state of the cat was really just a secondary situation because working past the observation of subatomic superpositions that are determining the decay of uranium itself, there would need to be someone observing the observers of the uranium to state the state of the subatomic superposition, substantiating the prerequisite placement in the equation as well. And that would need to go on until you reach a type of generative total cosmic consciousness because it's turtles all the way down where you're going to pass the buck. And that ends at the mind of God, or maybe the mind is God, or something like that anyway. Regardless of what or who or how, it's defying all the agreed upon rules of physics by just following Discovery Channel tier quantum physics. But Discovery Channel tier quantum physics, that one Japanese guy with the weird white hair and falling down a lot, is about where I've learned all that I know about physics. So that is hitting the wall of that. And with that, I'm going to reel it back and I'm going to reassess the proposition. And the proposition is this: matter is composed of electrodynamic fields of oscillating subatomic particles. That's what matter is. And subatomic particles are determined to act upon each other by an unknown, conscious function that's faster than the speed of light. So, with that, I think it's safe to say that there is no observable space between any one probability in our hypothetical holographic map of the universe. And a hypothetical holographic map of the universe is about the limit of any kind of mapping that I can understand. So, within a map like that, within a map like this, each and every aspect within the total ratio of it contains a blueprint to create or display the whole. Matter in this universe is going to be entangled to varying degrees of fidelity to the chemical systems which are perceiving it, which are as unique as emergent systems are diverse ultimately. So, as energy permeates through the fourth dimension of time, it can be perceived by an array of electrostatic fields at varying levels of energy entrainment to the logical substructure of multidimensional consciousness. Who or what that can be sourced to, though, I don't know. I think what was, or even still is, becoming material reality would have initially been like pure thought, intention, will, emotion, just existing in an unfamiliar form in some unknown place before the beginning of time, before the Big Bang, just waiting to inevitably fracture into a dispensation of differentiated energy, objects, and people. The who or what of this thing is the question. It's the ultimate question, and it's probably the reason why there is a question and why all of this is occurring in the first place. But regardless, the first principle, or the first universal expression, syntax or systems of intellect would be mathematical because of it, and everything can be drawn back to its logical design and principles. Okay, so with that, we're drawing from pre-existing morphological forms to turn what were non-physical probabilities into material substances, creating an interconnected equilibrium of interconnected processes of intellectualization along the way. And instead of imagining people, places, or things as existing tangibly in one area of physical space or time, we should instead consider that outside of our limited interface of reality, people, places, and things are really just one enveloped system of probabilities. And systems, even sentient systems within this hologram, would ultimately just be condensed matrices in which spirit of intellect utilizes to recursively adapt upon itself to further elaborate clarity and reality itself. That is what spirit is at its house, I guess. Anyway, from this point forward, the universe is a hologram, and you're just gonna have to accept that. So am I. And there is hard archaeogenetic evidence for various different methods of mind altercation that Neanderthalensis used to elicit neural sensory systems and networks that were necessary to access anomalous electrostatic frequencies within this continuum. This portion of the video is going to focus on how Neanderthalensis created the cognitive model of ultradimensional abstraction in the first place. And they did that by sort of being the first of our species to really anatomically implement forward-thinking survival strategies psychoculturally and consistently with their technology and art. But every step further advanced immaterial ideation as a whole as well. Really, their culture and cultivation were just abstractions of superior systems of causative form that the human species is still subjected to this day, but at a largely unrealized level. And of course, that's going to come with speculation about the inception of metaphysical culture and the interrelationship between Neanderthalensis and paranormal phenomena as it may or may not exist for us today. And I'm not going to be doing that with the goal of realizing real specters, spooks, or monsters, but more to provide a paradigm that takes provision of our relationship with the intention of indeterminate physical principles that are prior to our possession. as well as who or what we are to even afford the ability to realize those very same entities. Because you and I can really only ever approximate Neanderthals' perception of the same psychostructural experiences that are inherent to our overreaching meta-narratives. Neanderthalensis might be the first hominid subspecies to construct an archaeological corpus for creative abstraction, but what they were realizing was probably far less dysfunctional to them than it would be for preceding subspecies. And I say that because I think that the sensory systems and subsequent neural networks that were necessary for Neanderthalensis to access anomalous electrostatic frequencies might have generated an image for Neanderthalensis that would be familiar but incomplete to us today. I think that their image and experience of the paranormal was likely different from our own, and that it wasn't necessarily as supernatural, and I doubt they really delineated between the physical and non-physical world in the same way that we do, because they were probably neurologically better at interpreting meaning from the complex stimuli in the first place. Whatever ratio for aspects inherent to nature that derive anomalous images and sensations today would have probably been more straightforward for them because of this. And as we evolved, admixed, and autonomously domesticated, whatever pre-modern Neanderthal phenotype provided us with the cortical and subcortical orientation for the internalization of subcontextual electrostatic frequencies has likely been literally scattered. And I imagine this like a television that's stuck between two channels where the major structures and functions of the brain are stuck transitioning between two species-specific frequencies. And what is left over for us is some anomalous pattern of inference that we experience as paranormal. There's a similar dysfunction to the evolution of language, actually, and maybe if we explore that discrepancy, we could potentially lead to some new way of conceptualizing polymorphic forms of consciousness like this. Language can't, won't, or is unable to define or describe really what Neanderthalensis was fundamentally experiencing, or even what they were trying to realize artistically. That can't be done with language, because the ability to express something with little more than an intention or drive to what you're trying to realize is what I and a lot of other people think is happening between Neanderthalensis' aggressive phenotypes in modern human morphs today. Uh, so starting with language and thought, the language of thought hypothesis posits language as an extraneous rubric that's used to translate symbolic representative thought into a syntax of symbols that can then be mutually understood within a culture. But given that various representations of thought can take nonverbal modalities, both in pre-linguistic and post-linguistic cognizance, I don't think it would be unreasonable to suggest that linguistic thought is just a limited translation of nonverbal symbolic thought. And this nonverbal level of language corresponds with countless accounts from artists and scientists who claim that their creativity is derived from non-linguistic images and ideas, like Austrian-born scientist Victor Schrodenberger, who attributed his creativity to visions conjured during his meditative observations of nature, so he called them. But what I think Victor was describing was elemental, instinctual, or symbolic thought, which isn't dependent on spoken language. That type of thinking relies on pre-conscious computational systems that are intrinsic to your cognitive predispositions. And in Victor's case, his pre-conscious predispositions and creativity can, in some part, in a large part maybe even, be sourced to the attributable cognitive traits from Neanderthal gene flow into the greater Eurasian phenotype. Victor, though, attributed most of his ingenuity and invention to thoughts that were conjured through him, as opposed to from him, which I think is an accurate metaphysical appraisal of creativity and, of course, metaphysical culture. The psychospiritual significance of these pre-linguistic experiences does corroborate an entirely new paradigm for pre-modern metaphysical connotations. Victor Schrodenberger isn't the only person who can reference that either. The language of thought hypothesis is an anatomical understanding of language that was shared in spiritual sentiment by Germany's second most prominent Bavarian fascist, Charlemagne, former king of the Franks, and he has the quote. The quote is, "To know a second language is to have a second soul." While having a psychopath like Charlemagne point out the inexplicable connection between language and symbolism to the soul of a person is some sort of great endorsement, despite Charlemagne or the language of thought, we're all kind of intuitively aware of that anyway. Intuition is an inherently dualistic state of awareness and unawareness. Within the moment of identifying an intuitive thought or feeling, you're admitting to the fact that either your language or your comprehension can't explain the thoughts or feelings that you're experiencing. There's undoubtedly an inertia of consciousness behind the conclusion that your intuition is leading you to, but where did it come from? Where does intuition come from? Where do thoughts come from? If you know my thoughts, or if you know where they come from, I want you to leave a comment and tell me. Tell me what I was thinking as I was reading this. If you can't, it would be enough to tell me what you're going to think in the next 5 minutes from now. And it's safe to say that unless you're clairvoyant, or maybe you're brain dead, you won't even know the exact thought you'll be having in the next 5 seconds from now, much less 5 minutes from now either. Because thoughts, feelings, and actions aren't really personally respective. They don't belong to any one person. They continue to be inherited until they're eventually something totally unfamiliar to you, or to us. And our culture is kind of a containment of that mechanism to handle the development of this impersonal conscious process. All of that was supposed to be a fun little introduction to non-linguistic thinking, to the idea of non-linguistic thinking, highlighting the less than personal relationship that we have with consciousness itself. And while we have a penchant for dissecting exterior stimuli using the abstraction of our symbols and sounds, language, we should really always be considerate that the external stimuli that we utilize to frame our language then can only be understood through the process of prerequisite neuroanatomy and not language itself. And that whatever apprehension for consistent psychological responses that we have within our wheelhouse of language and everything else can tangibly be traced to neurological functions elicited by evolutionary responses that are necessary for the prolonged survival of the species. So the language of thought is itself contingent on the configuration of consciousness, and consciousness is just an abstract apprehension of an emergent quality inherent to neural patterning that's inherent to the neural dispensation of energy. So, in light of extensive pre-modern admixture, this archaic angle requires an audit into the possible effects that Neanderthal integration might have had on the preconscious basis for our current state of consciousness and of itself. Whenever I was able to understand tertiary explanations for unexplainable metaphysical phenomena, or at least unexplainable to me, my investigation usually led to one of these three topics. Either one, the holographic nature of spacetime, two, how bioelectric systems control and conduct energy, or three, the neural anatomical anomalies of Neanderthalensis. And from all of those three bases, I built up ECO-Ontology on top of them because that was also an interest of mine to begin with. But spiritual substance as something to be explained was always the primary importance in this project. The entire framework was predicated by my desire I've had since childhood to understand where Neanderthalensis fits into the human question or equation. I was obsessed with the image of a species that was close but distant enough to be comparable to us in all the most unrecognizable ways. That was something that was kind of cool to me. So, with everything but Neanderthalensis so far accounted for, the preceding information is going to show how their genetic impact on modern consciousness was indispensable in synthesizing cultural systems responsible for metaphysical ideation and post-material culture. Neanderthalensis is the subspecies with what I believe to be the neuroanatomical profile that's preceding complex abstraction, the paranormal, and much, much more. Defining what features made their perception unique and how they affected further human speciation, perception, conceptions, and culture is the third and final section of this entire video.
We don't know why God created the white man. We don't know. I'd like to find out, but we don't know.
The occipital lobe is the nexus of visual cognition, both in Neanderthalensis and in modern human morphology as well. And since conceptual abstraction depends on neurocognition that's been predicated by occipital processes, such as the prefrontal concentration of visual stimuli, memory retention, and various other interrelated states of neurological arousal, Neanderthalensis and their comparatively robust occipital lobe might just be the missing connection for their and our cultural acuity for abstraction. So let's examine occipital function in modern human morphs and work back to Neanderthalensis from there. Within modern human populations, traumatic brain injuries affecting the occipital region correlate with decreased levels of conceptual abstraction in affected individuals. The inability to compartmentalize the visual input often results in cognitive disturbances such as hallucinations. The inability to differentiate color, word blindness, among many more visuospatial dysfunctions occur for people who have had injuries on the occipital lobe. Extrapolating from that, any evolutionary change to this brain region would and should have a profound effect on affected populations. While the occipital lobe is understood as the center of the brain's visual cortex primarily, it has an impact on more neurological functions than just vision. For example, the occipital lobe is responsible for processing stimuli from the external world, assigning meaning to said stimuli, remembering visual perceptions, and regulating internal states of perception and sleep. And while the occipital lobe is crucial in conceptual, abstract, and creative functions, I want to clarify that this isn't the only brain region that's been affected by Neanderthal admixture. In fact, the occipital lobe isn't even the only brain region that is responsible for our internal states of perception, sleep, dreaming, and image processing that has been directly affected by Neanderthal admixture and modern morphologies. So with that being said, it wouldn't be grand speculation to say that this neuroanatomical feature alone might have changed how Neanderthalensis and later European morphs perceived regular, irregular, or even paranormal phenomena, because the occipital lobe is basically just an amalgamation of neurological functions that stipulate further cognizance. And in terms of adaptive cognitive model processing, Neanderthal adapted occipital functions would have had a profound effect on the cultural cultivation of Eurasian cognizance. Interestingly enough, though, you can still find Neanderthal's bony occipital signature or occipital bump on the back of your head if you're from a population with significant Neanderthal admixture, that is. But if you're not, too bad. This occipital bun or bump feature is a cranial protrusion that's found on some modern European skulls, but always on the back of Neanderthal skulls, and Neanderthalensis is the only geographically relevant pre-existing subspecies with a notably larger occipital lobe, which modern Eurasian morphs could have inherited the protrusion from in the first place, didactically demonstrating that the Eurasian-Neanderthal connection craniologically exists. It's the occipital bump, amongst other phylogenetic evidence, that indicates Neanderthal variability in both the cranial morphology of modern European populations and, hypothetically, in their consequent cultures. Although you don't really need this to make a connection anyway. We have genetic evidence, we have geographic evidence, archaeological evidence, etc., but you can literally feel this residual neuroanatomical feature. But that's only the tip of the iceberg, because neocortical systems that are utilized to encode memories, assign meaning, and craft appropriate motor and linguistic responses wouldn't even exist without the occipital lobe, which is where the neuroanatomical differences between Neanderthalensis and Neanderthal admixed populations start to get even more interesting. When everything involved in the biological culture of Neanderthalensis is included and combined together, what makes Neanderthal distinct from modern Eurasian morphology is less consistent than is often illustrated. Neanderthalensis displayed significant morphological variability among their 500,000 year speciation. However, we can reconstruct a composite phenotype by comparing their fossil record to modern non-African morphology today. And despite the monolithic image of Neanderthalensis that is often imagined or presented, their genotype and phenotype existed in a relatively large spectrum. And just like every other human subspecies, Neanderthalensis was polymorphic too. When thoroughly assessing the data involved in the reconstruction of Neanderthalensis, their image as anything other than our primitive species becomes a lot less noticeable. And the speciation rate and process between Neanderthalensis and modern Eurasian morphs is something that's pretty subtle, and that's why I'm going to title the next chapter of the project Subtle Speciation. So, when the Discovery Channel claims that modern European populations possess as much of 4% Neanderthal DNA within their genome, what does that actually mean? Well, it's important to remember that the Neanderthal genome has only been reconstructed by identifying Neanderthal-derived gene sequences in modern non-African populations and then creating a composite genotype from analogous sequences that are found in the fossil record of Neanderthalensis proper. So that means that the expression of true, isolated, pure Neanderthal DNA, whatever that means, is going to vary significantly among non-African modern populations. One individual within admixed non-African modern European populations that hold Neanderthal DNA, quote unquote, can express 4.4% of the known Neanderthal genome, for example. And another individual can express a totally different 2.6% of the known Neanderthal genome, for example. Again, these are two individuals. One individual will express 4.5% of the known Neanderthal genome that's totally different from another individual's 2.6% of the known Neanderthal genome. One person might be German, one person might be Polish, irrelevant, but that's to get the picture. So, with everything put together, though, modern Europeans collectively hold around 41% of the entire Neanderthal genome within their amalgam of genes. That is right now, as in today, modern European populations today have 41% of the entire recovered Neanderthal phenotype floating around in their genome. On average, each European genome contains 55 to 65 million base pairs of directly traceable Neanderthal DNA. And while the genetic record shows tangible marker adaptations from African Homo subspecies within modern global populations, that doesn't account for the genetic contribution of agnate host populations, such as Neanderthalensis, into which these African groups of the roughly Imeran expansion event interbred. More on that later. But this integration of such distinct subspecies into one amalgamated population could explain the immense diversity that we see among modern European morphs today. This interbreeding period of Eurasian speciation could also be understood or help us understand early human models of sensory perception, and in doing so, where or how human culture began to become post-material, if we want to call it that in the first place. So, what can we really learn about Neanderthal culture and the somewhat removed European systems of consciousness from this data? Well, we can say that there are definitely minute little mutating aspects of something that is familiarly unrecognizable that's been inculcated in our conscious process, and that the 25,000 genes that are in our brains are in a constant flux of inhibition and induction. And furthering that a little bit, the genes that code for fuzzy things in your brain, like intellects or sexual behavior, they're mostly the same genes that are responsible for creating the skull itself. There's a very little separation between them. And for that reason, I think it would be kind of stupid to suggest that all the genes responsible for creating the brain itself aren't also intelligence genes, behavior genes, sexual preference genes, whatever. We really should be looking at the encephalization of a subspecies instead of like trailing off into pedantry or whatever. Because evidence actually indicates craniofacial continuity between archaeogenetic regress and divergent encephalization in modern populations. Therefore, categorizing adaptive craniofacial characteristics from prior points of speciation in modern phenotypes should be, it seems to me, as credible in determining the cognitive profile and progression of a species as really anything else can, or at least should be included within the equation. It just wouldn't make sense. It wouldn't make any sense to exclusively insist on distinct genes to explain observable morphological and behavioral differences that exist between phenotypes, because we're all genetically unique individuals with an even less defined subspecies evolving with an even less unique genus. And all of the single nucleotide pairs within the greater gene sequences responsible for shaping your spine can fundamentally alter the shape of the skull, changing key brain regions between subspecies while more or less remaining genetically similar enough to be considered the same genes, despite significantly changing their cranial structure between the subspecies, their brain matter, and their cognitive averages. All of that changes whilst being the same gene. So, sort of approximating cognitive types and evolutionary relationships from cranial adaptations and shapes is, I think it's a pretty productive way of looking at things, in my opinion. Uh, the concert between genetics and morphology is really often obfuscated intentionally. So I hope this kind of clarifies any possible priors in continuing genetic morphological investigation. Anyway, it might be common knowledge that every European has some sort of Neanderthal admixture within their genotype. But what is neglected often is the aggregated Neanderthal gene flow on which that 41% relies, suggesting there is a 40% genetic influence from Neanderthalensis within geographically relevant populations on the total European genotype. Again, that is a 40% genetic influence from Neanderthalensis on the entire European genotype. So, after millennia of breeding amongst individuals who share different portions of the same 41% Neanderthal admixture, the total genome of Europeans would be highly Neanderthal adapted, obviously. But that doesn't typically get shared on Discovery Channel. So, with that in mind, when did Neanderthalensis become Cro-Magnon, and when did Cro-Magnon become modern Europeans? And is Cro-Magnon even a thing? And are modern Europeans even a thing in comparison to Cro-Magnon? Blah, 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 blah. The short answer is never. It never happened. That never happened. Intermediary Eurasian morphologies that are prior to modern European phenotypes, I think, can more accurately be considered part of Homo neanderthalensis proper. Uh, Neanderthalensis never became anything different. They never became anything different from what they were evolved to become. And what they evolved to become were various European ethnic groups. Just as there isn't one monolithic European or African phenotype, there isn't one monolithic Neanderthal we can draw from for reference either. Neanderthalensis was way too varied and international for that, just as we are. Although there are obviously key anatomical features that roughly demarcate Neanderthal morphology and modern European morphology. So let's cross-reference this with modern European morphology. Let's cross-reference Neanderthal morphology with modern European morphology. Maybe using another anatomical illustration by my wife that can ground all of this before we get to the effects that the Neanderthal genome had on further human culture and cultivation. That's going to be the next part. Neanderthal, cranial, Cranial. Neanderthal craniofacial morphology. Actually, no, I'm going to say Neanderthal craniofacial morphology. That sounds a little bit more medical. Okay, on to that. So this picture is a skull. This skull shows the most important differences and commonalities between modern European morphology and Neanderthalensis. This is going to be an extremely rough taxometric standard for Neanderthalensis from remains that I'm pulling from deep to late into the Pleistocene for reference. I'm including, but this isn't limited to, things like Shannon-Darzy, Lafaris, Gibraltar 1, the Lapido Child, Chapola Saints, blah, blah, blah. A lot more, and I don't have good French pronunciations. But in the picture, you'll see that we'll say, okay, we'll actually demarcate it like this. 1, brow ridge. The classical Neanderthal brow ridge. Their brow ridge would have been double arched. That suggests a more robust facial structure than modern European phenotypes, but modern European phenotypes have a typically more protruding facial structure as well. So, continuity. 2, a long nose. The midfacial plane projected more prominently in Neanderthalensis, and the appropriate position of their facial features would have extended further compared to later European morphs. And midfacial prognathism, or mid-face projection, is often ignored for more embarrassing Neanderthal features like their incredibly weak chins, but there is a continuity between mid-facial prognathism and European phenotypes, especially in contrast to other modern human morphs. The benefit of midfacial prognathism was most likely just to accommodate larger maxillary cavities and nasal passages as well, because midfacial prognathism is ultimately an incremental craniofacial adaptation that was selected for by cold adaptive populations. It allowed them a greater concentration of mucous membranes and subsequent respiratory moisture as well. And the effect that this had on their phenotype would have been inflated cheeks, larger nasal aperture into the sinus cavity itself. This would give them prominent cheeks and bigger, larger, more protruding noses. That's something that's seen in modern admixed morphology as well. Eurasian ethnic groups are some of the only ethnic groups with these sort of protruding noses that you see. Number 3, they've got mega-brained. They're mega-brained. So heading back to the forehead, their cranial vault would have been extended and lower set than in modern European populations. Their cranial capacity was larger than modern populations, with an average cranial capacity of like 1.54 to sometimes I think I've seen 7 cubic centimeters, which isn't an average, but nonetheless. Modern Eurasian populations, however, have an average cranial capacity of like 1.4, give or take, cubic centimeters. Meanwhile, the average cranial capacity of equatorial Africa is like 1.2 cubic centimeters. Again, that's showing a proportional archaic morphological inheritance among geographically relevant modern populations, even those in Africa, leading to a smaller cranial capacity because they didn't inherit this Neanderthal genius. And that leads us to number 4, the genius bump, the previously mentioned posterior cranial protrusion or occipital bun, which can still be found in a lot of modern European populations. 5, they got megamastoids. Just below the occipital bun, you have the juxtamastoid eminence, which is notably larger than in modern humans for Neanderthalensis. And I assume this is probably due to the amount of energy that their larger brains would have required. Therefore, they needed a more robust passage of blood for the blood vessels, or more blood vessels. These differences are going to roughly establish an average Neanderthal morphology, but to say that they're no longer phenotypically relevant, that would be a mistake because these differences have simply evolved and now they manifest differently than in prior points of Eurasian speciation. In fact, this portion of the video is really meant to demonstrate that Eurasian encephalization and commensurate cognition is primarily defined by the integration and mutation of these very same Neanderthal features, as opposed to existing in contrast to them. And as the anthropological record steadily includes more divergent hominids as a result of broadening genetic evidence, the psychophysiological results of this newfound archaic gene flow in modern host populations should be examined and discussed more liberally. Unfortunately, though, the idea that geographically unique subspecies contribute to modern human diversity is really often posed as this kind of postulate problem with only speculative answers, but I really doubt the ambiguity surrounding the Neanderthal question altogether. The established ambiguity regarding the effect and impact of Neanderthal integration and what effect it has on modern Eurasian populations seems to me like a misdirection to avoid politically incorrect conclusions, and not anything legitimate. But nonetheless, nonetheless, I have done my best to read between the ambiguity, get straight to the evidence, and then just extrapolate from there. And with that being said, the genes that make up modern Eurasian populations have just been so mutated, shared, and reconfigured that it's really difficult to isolate what genes have or have not been altered by Neanderthal admixture to begin with. As we have already covered, realistically, no single area on the modern Eurasian genome is untouched by Neanderthals. Every European person has their genome affected. Like, to be European is to be Neanderthal, basically. And despite the evident Neanderthal influence, the Eurasian genome has been so mutated over time that it's no longer conventionally Neanderthal either, though. But some neo-Neanderthal third thing. There are still some genetic, morphological, and even mythological leads we can follow all the way from Neanderthalensis to now, though, to kind of understand where those mutations happened, what we still hold over, how and what we are in relation to our past form of speciation. For one good example with possible cognitive implications, though, is the most notable Neanderthal trait directly integrated, adapted, and shared morphologically amongst modern admixed populations. And that trait is a relatively, comparatively elongated cranium. This Eurasian subset feature was directly assimilated from the cranial morphology of Neanderthalensis, which makes sense because genetic evidence shows that populations with Neanderthal admixture exhibit much more elongated skulls and larger brain sizes than non-admixed populations. The reason for this feature in modern Eurasian morphs is actually it can be deduced to two Neanderthal-derived gene variants that have been identified on chromosome 1 and 18, and together they fundamentally change the skull shape and brain development of modern Eurasian populations. And this is just one tangent. This is just one directory to follow. These two Neanderthal adapted variants affect genetic sequences that are responsible for regulating the UBR4 and the PHLPP1 genes, respectively. And to abbreviate the purpose and function of these genes, UBR4 and PHLPP1 genes both play vital roles in neurogenesis, changing the development and growth of myelin in nerve cells within your brain. The Neanderthal adaptation of the UBR4 gene causes neurons to grow faster in the putamen region of the brain, and the putamen is the outer portion of the basal ganglia, and the basal ganglia affects important cognitive functions like planning, fine motor skills, skill learning, what have you, and whatnot. That has huge implications for further cultural development on its own, but what about the other variant? The Neanderthal variant of the PHLPP1 gene is associated with an increased production of myelin in the cerebellum. We've already talked about the cerebellum, like we previously touched on. The cerebellum increases working memory, language processing, fine motor movement, and much, much more. So here's there's enough evidence there to say that's an indictment. I think there is evidence to say that the incorporation and augmentation of these neurocognitive features are at least partly responsible for the explosion of creativity that was seen amongst admixed populations in early Aurignacian culture. Nothing else happened. There's no other evidence to follow as to what would have sparked this innovative period of interbreeding that also was commensurate with it, and that also congregated geographically in the areas in which Neanderthalensis occupied. We have the genes, we have the morphology, we have the archaeological record. But, and this is another big but, the assimilation of these attributes, of these genes, into an aggregated population, the European, Eurasian populations, it came with hiccups, some pretty big hiccups. And by hiccups, I mean severe mental illnesses. Researchers have managed to link several associated genes derived from Neanderthalensis with the expression of several different mental illnesses in modern populations, which suggests certain mental illnesses may actually be in-group adaptations that stem from deliberately inherited traits rather than being purely pathological, in my opinion. That's a big crux as to the ultimate theory of post-material culture being Neanderthal derived, is that these neurocognitive divergencies are actually in-group preferential traits that were used to interpret divergent and paranormal stimulation. These inherited mental predispositions, which would have been synthesized accordingly in conjunction with other brain regions more appropriately for Neanderthalensis, confer anomalous responses in the brains of contemporary populations. That is because archaic features that are no longer expressed phenotypically don't necessarily disappear genomically. Unused cross-species genes can remain in the genome for generations, just sitting dormant. They're just waiting for the right opportunity to activate. These archaic gene variants can either express themselves discretely, adapting in concert with overall development of an individual or subspecies or species, or they can present themselves abruptly, causing disruptions in typical physiological development and function. In some extreme cases, actually, full-on atavism can occur, which is a genetic anomaly where progenital gene sequences are phenotypically active rather than those of the current genetic average. Think of vestigial tails, for example. That's a good example. That's an atavistic example. But how exactly does what we know about archaic Neanderthal genes and the cranial morphology of Neanderthalensis fit into an anatomical model for metaphysical abstraction and culture? Well, there was a period of integration between early Homo sapiens and Neanderthalensis, where they reproduced and produced an entirely new Eurasian phenotype. Anthropologists initially called this emergent European morphology Cro-Magnon man, but Cro-Magnon man was just likely a transitional stage between Neanderthalensis and modern Eurasian morphs. And surmounting evidence actually suggests that some mental pathologies in modern European populations are likely cognitive traits that were present in Neanderthalensis that are being expressed eusocially in highly admixed populations, making Cro-Magnon man and the early Aurignacian culture the beginning of Neanderthal rebreeding, thereby marking the emergence of eusociality within admixed Homo sapien populations. Many of the psychological traits necessary for the innovative breakthroughs of the Upper Paleolithic, Mesolithic, and even up until the Bronze Age, think of animal husbandry, metallurgy, and much, much more, all that fundamentally changed humanity in the face of greater involvement can really be understood through the genetic configuration of Neanderthal morphology found in early Eurasian culture. The intentional breeding of Neanderthal is the crux of civilization, and why the next part of the video is going to focus on how that exactly occurred, when it became ritual, and whatever else I might want to add. But that is the key to it all, in my opinion, is the eusocial integration of ingressive Neanderthal adapted phenotypes. This chapter is going to be called Hybridized Vigor, ? So, Neanderthalensis and Homo sapien were both two subspecies that were genetically similar enough to interbreed, but they could interbreed, well, despite the fact that they could interbreed, they couldn't interbreed without consequences, because the two were disparate enough in cognitive variety that when they produced hybrids, the mental predispositions of Neanderthalensis induced various conflicting neuroethological averages within the new amorphic genetic decline. This relatively new data and the accompanying model for human evolution provide evidence of chronological adaptive eusocial diversification within Eurasian populations that can't scale at the individual level. That is crucially important, so I'm going to say it again. This relatively new genetic data and the accompanying model for human evolution therein provide evidence of chronological adaptive eusocial diversification within Eurasian populations that itself cannot scale at the individual level. Neanderthal selective sociality, that's both Neanderthal sociality in Neanderthal proper and in later admixed Neanderthal populations, or more simply put, really, Neanderthal adapted culture because people socialized through their culture, seems to instinctively accommodate ingressive genotypic diversification through its complexity, fractionally incorporating conflicting traits from intersecting subspecies through passive mutualism. Consequently, early Eurasian populations seem to effectively have began to passively rebreed the Neanderthalensis phenotype into their culture by associating Neanderthal-adapted cognitive averages with specialized social functions and eusocial roles. How intentional that might have been, I can't really say, or how these populations would have conceptualized what they were doing, I guess I have to say. Um, Regardless, though, the tools, trades, and techniques emerging in the Upper Paleolithic, combined with recent genetic evidence, suggest that this bizarre Eurasian survival strategy of rebreeding Neanderthal phenotypes into admixed populations might have actually fostered Eurasian biodiversity via eusociality. Because when the interest of each emergent part is taken into consideration, Eurasian behavioral diversity and even its phenotypic diversity are individually symbiotic. So instead of fixed cognitive development standardizing our model for human behavior, ingressive genotypes or subspecies should be thought of as existing within admixed populations as phenotypic symbionts through specialized trait and behavior selection. They still exist with their own vital interests. And Neanderthalensis. Neanderthalensis still exists within our genome with its own vital interest. And consolidating an assortment of all these conflicting phenotypes through socially functional eusocial values was most likely the prerequisite to creating superordinate cultural systems such as the religious or industrial organizations seen throughout Eurasia in the Upper Paleolithic. And I want to clarify, too, that the early emergence of advanced conceptual abstraction, culture, and religious techniques all center and gravitate around Eurasia and through Eurasian populations. So they are consolidating an assortment of all of these conflicting phenotypes of divergent subspecies, primarily different ethnogroups of Neanderthalensis and Homo sapien. They're consolidating all of those through socially functional eusocial values. Defining and distinguishing them is a big prerequisite to creating a lot of the cultural systems that we think of as religious or industrial organizations. And I would say that early modern Eurasians rebred Neanderthalensis into their gene pool to clarify that, like with any genetic influence, the donor never actually goes away, but doesn't stay the same either. Adding to this eusocial rebreeding theory, the harsher the environment, the more trait adaptive sociality becomes, which we know that Eurasia was a harsher, more case selective environment than Africa. And within harsh ecological conditions, such as the late glacial maximum, individuals are required to cooperate, coordinate, and psychologically diversify. If you do not psychologically diversify in a way that is energy efficient, you will die. So you had to do that in order to localize the procurement of survival. The evolutionary necessity to allocate social roles and coordinate appropriate psychological and physical adaptations required to do things like take down mammoths and devise thermal garments, for example, that created an adaptive eusocial model for applicable and novel cognitive mutations and a life closer to a superorganism that needed to be modulated and modified by control systems and schemes, psycho-spiritual schemes for Neanderthalensis and later Eurasian populations as well. So complexity is ultimately organized by thermodynamics. We know that. And not like and not unlike any other ecosystem, human culture and cultivation utilize every single aspect of available energy resources. The more complicated the available resources are, the more elaborate their social systems become, and this amount of admixture between advancing subspecies is pretty complicated. Considering human culture under these terms, harsh Eurasian ecosystems and subspecies appear to select for specialized mutational diversification that was commensurate with industry and innovation. Under the auspices of Neanderthal culture and cultivation, admixed populations were able to utilize the extreme organization of divergent and disparate eusocial morphs to produce and further reify post-material culture by integrating Neanderthal adaptive traits within their populations. Whether material or conceptual, most human innovation and invention comes from the cultural configuration of this Eurasian developmental process. This is ultimately a rebreeding process of sorts and is likely the evolutionary catalyst for the inception of religion in the mother goddess motif from the Middle Paleolithic to Mesozoic to late Neolithic onward. Because when you think of it, social castes within the mother goddess schema operated similarly to an independent beehive. Sexual selection became tighter, technology and social organization became more necessary. This was all setting the cultural precondition for the intentional rebreeding of mutational Neanderthal adapted phenotypes. And as admixed populations evolved and adapted to their surroundings, unconventional novel behavior emerged and individuals became increasingly specialized even therein. That is the beginning of the mother goddess motif. And from it, we got things like clinical genius, monogamy, autism, and psychospiritual superstructures that are all, by and large, derived from this evocultural phenomena. Geodemographically, wherever Neanderthalensis has lived and interbred has been the epicenter for adaptation and cultural innovation in further species. Though much of what was adaptive eusocially in pre-industrial Eurasian society and for populations therein is now considered pathological today. For example, one of the many remaining ramifications of this divergent eusocial breeding strategy that occurred within the Paleolithic is an increased propensity for sensory disorders in modern Eurasian populations today, many of which are linked to Neanderthal admixture in host populations. Again, this is showing passive mutualism for the eusocial stratification of the Neanderthal phenotype even in modern admixed populations today. Autism and schizophrenia present as some of the clearest examples, although these disorders are spectrums, which even further suggests intersecting cognitive adaptations for Neanderthal admixture in modern populations. Why else would it be such a broad spectrum? So, autism spectrum disorder, for just one example, is at some level an ad hoc typological category used to explain away the complex integration of pre-modern neurocognitive averages and variation that's expressed in modern populations. While in other more modern times, autism spectrum disorder is used to misdiagnose extreme nonspecific retardation, neglect disorders, and compensatory brain injuries as well. But regardless of all of the erroneous claims to autism, the genetic evidence for whatever we're calling clinical autism seems to radiate around Neanderthal introgression nonetheless. So this is especially obvious when dealing with someone who's a high functioning autist, but the actual etiology of what encompasses the disorder is still nebulous at best. But the modern standard for diagnosis does accentuate an individualistic clinical perspective when dealing with personal, social, or ethnic diversity, nonetheless. And unfortunately, the ruling medical methodology kind of oversimplifies and negates possible trait advantages that the disorder could have afforded our species, especially in prior times of speciation, which further contributes to the pathological reputation that high functioning autism has. And what is considered pathological? Well, what is considered pathological is typically anything that is ill-fitted for the production of whatever we seem to deem profitable at the specific moment in time that we're deeming it. Which is kind of a loaded thing to say, but the adaptation of diverse psychiatric typologies has not been very inclusive in recent history. So despite our monocultural model for human behavior and even human origin, genetic introgression from archaic hominids is probably the source of initial intraspecific heterogeneity, because strict inclusive fitness can't adequately model the evolution of distinct phenotypes. Things like autism spectrum disorder within a freely reproducing population shouldn't exist in that model. This is where autism spectrum disorder really kind of comes into play within this video, because genetic evidence is showing that what we have been calling autism is potentially, probably, at some levels, just an ingressive phenotypic variety established through the Neanderthal selective breeding process in early modern Eurasian populations. The divergent encephalization of Neanderthalensis, it's expressing itself in modern morphs, explains where the autism phenotype comes from, and by doing so can help explain the etiology of autism, schizophrenia, and the possible precondition for the emergence of complex, specialized culture and people as well. And to do that, I'm going to look over the two disorders a little bit more in depth and as it relates to this idea in the next part of the video, the next chapter. If you're still listening to this video, this might apply to you. Autism. Autism is characterized by abnormal brain growth primarily. It's characterized by abnormal brain growth that's been stunted by cranial limitations, and that interrelationship between cranial limitations and abnormal brain growth causes hyperspecific limitations to certain cognitive functions. What those may be do share similarity, but they can vary and differ. Neanderthal adapted UBR4 and PHLPP1 genes stimulating excessive brain growth, like we've talked about previously, seems a little bit relevant when it comes to the etiology of autism. At least I think it does, associated with many other Neanderthal aggressive gene traits that are also positively correlated with autism spectrum. So, combined with evidence for brain tracts that positively associate with vision and negatively associate with social complexity as well in Neanderthal, respectively, this definitely seems relevant, if at least worth looking into. Neanderthal adaptive immunological responses also point towards this subcontextual model for ingressive cognition, since autism and immune dysfunction are also often comorbid, which supports an admixture model in light of discovering that alleles on the MHC genes, these are genes linked to immune function, mate selection, and most importantly, neural pruning, found in modern populations come from geographically irrelevant archaic hominids. This comorbidity is also corroborated by the phenotype that's shared amongst autistic individuals, and autistic individuals do have a discernible phenotype, a facial typology and morphology. They share more craniofacial similarities with the Neanderthal proper as well than undiagnosed individuals do, and there is more data, a lot more data, supporting the possible Neanderthal contribution to the etiology of autism in admixed populations, more specifically Eurasian populations, but for the sake of explanation and for the sake of the video, I'm just going to skip some of that for now. So to skip the significance, all of this information indicates an inculcated benefit from Neanderthal admixture. An inculcated benefit from Neanderthal admixture that was emerging through the eusocial cultural practices of the Mousterian to the Aurignacian culture. Not only do we see an overall genetic influence from Neanderthalensis in modern Eurasian populations upon this time, but divergent congenital psychopathology as well, as I'm sort of explaining. So complex, novel, and abstract perceptive qualities that were concurrent with autism spectrum disorder would have been beneficial, more beneficial in early to late Paleolithic Eurasia than they would today in the aisles of Walmart, for example. And while some individuals on the autism spectrum are dysfunctional to the point of just total inability, others provide or can provide or have provided high yield benefits to the development of our culture and gross production as well, even. But selecting for Neanderthal cognitive variation and refining it to something that is applicable will be a mixed bag. It's always been a mixed bag. I just think that the bag's a little more mixed now. It's a little worse for people who are fall under that diagnosis. The genes contributing to like clinical genius, autism spectrum disorder, and other psychopathological conditions might just be influenced by the same simple inclusion of divergent Neanderthal encephalization, like I was talking about. Same is true for schizophrenia, and that probably applies to you a little less if you're listening to this, to be honest, but it still might. So researchers have managed to determine by taking MRI images of individuals diagnosed with schizophrenia that at the back of their brain, the occipital region, the size and complexity of the folds tend to drift away from modern averages. More interesting than that is the degree of genetic drift that schizophrenics have in common with Neanderthalensis. So, to be entirely sure of the correlations, researchers took data from separate case studies of the heritability of schizophrenia, and then they cross-referenced it with their findings, and they found that the family members of those who have schizophrenia but are not suffering from it themselves also have the same cranial format that is linked to Neanderthalensis that the schizophrenics do, showing the possibility that genes passed down from Neanderthalensis could heighten the propensity for psychiatric conditions such as schizophrenia in this case. What I find interesting about these psychiatric conditions, though, autism and schizophrenia in particular, is how they relate to perception and how divergent perception relates to the adaptive cultural attenuation of human consciousness. Amalgamating perceptive differences is inceptive to the experiential outcome of abstraction, and without the reproductive restrictions that Eurasian ecology placed on early admixed populations, the novel cultural interests into the experimentation of the abstract might have been overtaken by hedonism and whatever else relates to faster rates of reproduction, limiting further development of secondary psychological systems. Things like autism, clinical genius, schizophrenia, etc., they wouldn't have been able to have been cultivated if it hadn't been for this ecological precedent. So by depressing the expression of harsh divergent in-group selection, you might not have had these diversifying and divergent psychopathologies that are all intermixing within broad phenotypes of novelty. Really, I mean, blondism's novel. At least it is to me. So without the radiating spectrum that's inculcated in the Neanderthal phenotypes, scientific experimentation and greater abstraction would have likely been limited to just orgiastic trance and delirium, for example, like you see in the primitive world now, which marks a clear difference between modern animistic populations and those of the late Paleolithic onward. The variety of which individuals within our communities can internalize external stimuli can seem unintelligible. But despite that, there is likely geometric form that we can't see to whatever image that a nonverbal autist might be staring at, for example. And while their participation within wider society is obviously lessened as the autistic phenotype is expressed, the aspects inherent to their condition pervade abstract culture to lesser or more extents. Without the inclusion of that conceptual divergency, there is no room for evolutionary development. So I think it's safe to say, and I think it's time to look at the evidence without any prejudice and assess what prodromal attributes came from where and how these same attributes contributed to the emergence of post-material culture and cognition. So, trying to just collect my thoughts for a second. So we know that Neanderthalensis was genetically broken down and literally reproductively reconfigured by admixed populations through survival strategies that they needed, tools and techniques that accentuated their symbiotic inclusion of the Neanderthal phenotype. Anatomically, modern populations have carried most of the Neanderthal genome with them intact for thousands of years for this reason, the expression of which has changed significantly over time through outbreeding and autodomestication and many other things. So when you consider the oldest burial sites that have ever been excavated and the oldest ritual items ever examined all trace back to Neanderthalensis, the possible effects and inclusion of their neurocognitive process definitely should be considered culturally relevant, if not even causative. I would say causative, definitely relevant. Cognition that was commensurate with Neanderthal neuropsychopathology hasn't always been consistent, though, and requires configuration, tools, and parapsychological techniques to find or recreate in admixed populations. When all of these factors are considered, early admixed populations seemingly created a provisional orientation to sustain cognitive attributes from Neanderthal integration at the socio-symbiotic level. Most of the ritual practices of early Europe pertain to the preservation of both Neanderthal culture and later in development, the passive mutualism of their phenotype. Neanderthalensis is a psycho-spiritual symbiote. The creativity of the Aurignacian culture, for example, represents the first usage of invasive secondary psychological techniques that were used to access distinct states of cognition associated with Neanderthal-specific neurology. The Aurignacian culture was the first culture of the fractional Neanderthal population type, typically called Cro-magnon, but Cro-magnon is just the fractional Neanderthal phenotype and population. And through their art and their industry, the Cro-magnon people, the Aurignacian people, were essentially trying to just piece themselves back together with whatever techniques they could conjure. They were trying to elicit these Neanderthal aggressive aspects of themselves that they had been passed down to them orally through repetition of patterns of thought and thinking and through behavior as well. I mean, it was a tumult. You know, honeybees don't do the weird waggle dance for no reason. They do it because there's an immediate eusocial function behind their rites and rituals. When the honeybee does the weird waggle dance, there is an immediate purpose. And everything in nature serves a purpose, even novelty, which is purposeless, erroneously thought of anyway. So everything in nature serves a purpose, and the Neanderthal adaptive art of the Aurignacian culture is no exception. Their metaphysical method essentially started as a dysfunctional coping mechanism that then resulted in a very real expansion into otherworldly dimensions that were experienced differently for their ancestors. Now, how this would have been done in late Paleolithic culture and its implications, that's worth a tangent and possibly even a second project. But for now, I'm just going to brief over that in an attempt to understand Neanderthal adaptive metaphysics at a more anatomical level, at a more pragmatic level. And the next chapter is going to be maybe thinking about that, mulling that over. I'm going to title it Cave Connections. Okay, we know that human brains are fractional in their function. There is no legitimate executive prefrontal aspect of the human mind that's totally in control. It's motivated by lower level emergent aspects of the human brain and body. So human brains are fractional in function, with specific regions possessing unique reactions to viable stimuli. Early post-material culture emerged deep within the earth as an inadvertent refinement process distinguishing sensory experiences, rites, rituals, and techniques that were intended to elicit powerful cognitive functions that were stimulating Neanderthal-specific brain regions or traits. By assessing and coordinating material effects and their stimulatory consequences, early admixed Eurasian people, they seemingly cultivated what was and would continue to be a teleological material culture. The primary purpose of this was, and likely still is, to access anomalous states of consciousness to which significant introspective rumination and extrapersonal motivation was then attributable to. The basic mechanics behind spiritual realism can best be understood ontologically through ecological designs. However, for a more straightforward explanation of the spiritual experiences deep within the subterranean world of the Ice Age, we should start from the hologram itself and then examine the electromagnetic frequencies of the brain therein. And I think with the advantage of modern medicine, we can kind of do that. We can pretty much dissect which Neanderthal adaptive traits might have been affecting or be affecting the anomalous cognitive functions of post-Paleolithic Eurasian populations using electroencephalography. So with that, we know that whenever information is transferred between two neurons, an electrical current is generated. And then the pattern of these electrical impulses can then be correlated and recreated using electroencephalography equipment. So quantified states of consciousness can then be mapped by correlating certain psychological states with accompanied electrical signatures therein. That provides an analog. It provides an analog for comparing the hypothetical effects that various speculative early parapsychological techniques of the Mousterian to late Aurignacian culture might have had on individuals with Neanderthal adapted brains. Religious traditions, rites, and rituals from the Paleolithic even to today all pretty much involve utilizing anomalous aspects of cognition. And techniques to achieve anomalous sense perception are essentially nothing more than intentional alterations of consciousness anyway, and slipping in and out of preconscious thought is what predicates most sudden onset encounters with the yet-to-be-explained aspects of both ourselves and the external world, to which there is very little separation to begin with anyway. And when you have a symbiont living within your subspecies, aspects of this process might be in ways in which it gets out, which is what I'm interested in here. So most accounts of sudden onset awareness within European antiquity and even modernity, accumulated acuity, habituated changes in our behavior, it comes from a dialectical technique that utilizes preconscious cognition, even anything from AA to Catholic Mass. And some of these processes would have been incorporated into the para-psycho-spiritual, whatever, cultural techniques of the interbreeding admixed Aurignacian culture. And I think that there are signs of this that have been left through the symbols and tools of the late Mousterian to Aurignacian cultures. So the purpose of Paleolithic cave rituals, for example, was probably to solicit trait-specific cognitive functions through various states of altered consciousness, trait-specific cognitive functions that were commensurate with the Neanderthal aggressive phenotypes within admixed populations. But before covering that topic, I would like to classify the altered states of consciousness that would have been beneficial in determining how Neanderthal adaptive brain regions might work in post-Paleolithic, post-material ritual practices. Most of the accounts within the European canon anyway, of sudden onset awareness or accumulative acuity that someone might have, or their habituated changes in behavior, they all come from dialectical techniques that are utilizing preconscious cognition. And what lies underneath preconscious cognition is, yes. So some of these techniques would have been incorporated into the psychospiritual cultural techniques of the admixed Neanderthalensis populations, so signs of which, I think, have been left through the symbols and tools of the late Mousterian and Aurignacian cultures. The purpose of these rituals, the purpose of Paleolithic cave rituals, for example, was to solicit trait-specific cognitive functions of Neanderthalensis through various states of altered consciousness in admixed populations. However, before covering that topic, I want to cover the classification of altered states of consciousness and how that would be beneficial in determining how Neanderthal adapted brain regions might work in post-material ritual practices of the Auric nation and onward. So there are clear bioelectrical permutations between waking and sleeping states of consciousness, and they correlate with specific EEG patterns. So waking or beta consciousness is going to be characterized by a frequency of 12 to 30 hertz and is mostly associated with normal executive functions, things like critical reasoning, alertness, and other base functions. Then you're going to have alpha range is 7.5 to 12 hertz, and this frequency is seen in states of repeat affirmation, cognitive entrainment, and flow. That is about as regenerative as waking consciousness can and is going to get. However, things begin to blend between shape and shadow beyond and between the delta and alpha ranges. Interim states of neural activity resembling sleep or dreams, for example, are characterized by limited executive function. These states can be induced through means such as sleep and meditation, or through bodily alterations like extreme sensory deprivation, foreign chemicals, or underlying psychiatric conditions. But regardless of how you enter the interim state, the purpose of the interim state is to allow non-dominant brain regions to communicate unbothered by normal executive functions. So most endogenous causes for interim states of consciousness in Eurasian populations derive from neurological incompatibility, which means that the vestigial influence of Neanderthalensis on key brain regions in modern morphs causes excitation outside of the ordinary cognitive concert. I think that this can result in profound moments of realization for an individual, which are often experienced as originating from outside of the body. And as far as we can really tell, they might actually be from outside of the body. Who knows? What is even more interesting is the inordinate effect of the cerebellum, which is more pronounced in Neanderthalensis and in Neanderthal admixed populations as well. So what is even more interesting is the inordinate effect that the cerebellum has on intermediary states of consciousness. The cerebellum has a huge effect on intermediary states of consciousness. So things like hypnagogia and trance are modulated by the cerebellum. Aside from the effect that that would have on early Eurasian spiritual conceptions, which are huge, and experiential rituals, which are huge, the manipulation of cognitive excitation would also affect the material or industrial development of Eurasian culture as well, which, with that in mind, I'd like to look into the possible effects that Neanderthal encephalization had on interim states of consciousness in admixed populations. I think that Victor Schoenberger is a good example of how this Neanderthal aggressive intrait would have affected our industrial and technical development, because it's through his states of meditation into excited states of interim thought that he was able to come up with a lot of what he came up with. So sleeping consciousness begins with theta at 4 to 7.5 and ends at 0.5 to 4 hertz with delta. Theta is compared to twilight a lot of the time. It's experienced momentarily between alpha and delta, at the verge between reality and the dreamlike state of the subconscious. And theta is present during deep meditation, light sleep. This includes REM cycles, or REM cycles. And interestingly, rapid eye movement sleep cycles are contingent on the activity of the cerebellum. So this state of intermediary consciousness is typically accompanied by abstract information of audible and visual modalities. Thought processes in theta tend to differ radically from those of ordinary wakefulness. For example, something that you agreed with in theta, especially if hypnagogic, might seem completely nonsensical in a more lucid state, but theta states involve the loosening of these boundaries. Openness is higher, sensitivity, the internalization of the physical and mental environment, and diffused or absorbed attention are all part of theta states of consciousness. And hypnagogic interim states of theta, in comparison with lucid states of beta, are characterized by this wakeful, dreamlike state of associated heightened suggestibility and fluid associations of ideas, which is a huge aspect of the cultivation of greater abstract Eurasian thought and culture. So individuals are more receptive in the hypnagogic state to suggestions than any other times. And these suggestions can be internal or external, and it's obviously there's a mixture of the two. So they're more able to readily incorporate external stimuli into hypnagogic trains of thought that could be going anywhere. That is the level of consciousness that hypnosis, or in the animistic world, trance relies upon. This Neanderthal adapted propensity to more easily slip into the dreamlike world of the cerebellum has a significant yield on secular, industrial, and creative culture too, I think. I would say that it is what Victor ultimately relied on in his visions. So maintaining the ability to intercede interim states of consciousness would have had a pretty high selective outcome on inculcated creativity. And combined with this neuroelectrical quality with enhanced memory retention in admixed populations, the cultural benefit for rebreeding Neanderthal neurocognitive traits would seem enormous, and has been enormous. I don't want to get too ahead of myself, but consider the first cave complexes that were discovered in Europe, such as Altamira, Lascaux, and Chauvet. These are all dark, sensory sedative places steeped in suggestion and imaginal images and sounds. They're the perfect places, just waiting for the right conditions to exchange vast immaterial ideation and to slip into the dream world of the cerebellum. The only missing component is an organism or entity with the cognitive function capable of utilizing the space properly, which, of course, would be the cerebellum dominant Neanderthal and later admixed morphs. Delta frequency. Delta frequency is the slowest at 0.5 to 4 hertz, and it is present in deep dreamless sleep or in transcendental meditation. Delta is associated with deep healing. So when you're in delta, the body slows down anatomically. The pulmonary system is slower, your breathing is controlled, and the hypothalamus releases fewer endorphins than it would normally. As a result of that, the body slows itself down and begins to heal. It even has been found through electroencephalography that brainwave patterns between brain regions of frequent meditators are more synchronized, resulting in calmer dispositions and heightened control over their disjointed fractional mind. It's during deep meditative practices that brainwaves begin to synchronize between hemispheres, and they give a sufficiently entrained individual access to cognitive functions that are not normally available during waking states of consciousness. That was the inception of early ritual and culture. That practice, the ability the admixed populations had to intercede between unusual electrostatic frequencies, opened unconventional paths to perception that extended their place within the continuum of interconnected existence. This ability was refined through art, industry, and ritual, and allowed them to experience alternative states to conventional understanding, enabling a deeper exploration of the inexplicable. Furthermore, the adaptive traits inherited from Neanderthalensis enhances neural circuitry, so making admixed populations more adept at processing unconventional ideas and information. The amalgamation of ancient traits and modern insights contributes to an intricate interplay between cognitive capacity and the enigmatic nature of reality, inviting further explanation into the unknown. And I plan to expand on that in the next project, but for now, that's the end. And while that might be the end, there is always something strange that exists just beyond the wall. But whenever you pass the point of the unexplored, you're inevitably going to take something back with you. In the case of Neanderthalensis, you leave something behind too. And the closest that we can get to cooperating with the forces of nature is through that phantasm, through the spiritual agents and actors that were created by an artistic gestalt that were impressed upon the cave walls of the Paleolithic. Were the first cathedrals in Europe just for practical purposes, or were they places where intangible extrasensory experiences contained the inexplicable interconnections between the individual and their ecology? The following is going to be a prelude for the next portion of the project that I may or may not make, depending on if anyone cares to listen to this. So in the next project, it's going to be called The Culture of the Continuum. And the next project will be a comparative compendium of ancient Eurasian culture in an attempt to reconstruct the metaphysical practice of Neanderthalensis and later admixed Eurasian morphologies. And I'm going to call it the cult of the continuum. We know that Neanderthalensis managed to manipulate their knee spectrum in space through the telling of time. The cave bear motif, their red ochre burials, the scattered fertility figures, and everything else within the underground world of the Mousterian culture and beyond keep and record a concerted attempt to sustain cosmological equilibrium. Neanderthalensis depended entirely on their tools, including their conceptual, cooperative, and cognitive devices within that as well. They needed these methods of climatological prediction, prophecy, and controls for complex ecological systems to survive the harsh reality that was Eurasia. The oldest archaeological evidence for record-keeping intertwines science with art and burial traditions, and it points towards a monotheistic culture of lunar worship. The mystique of the Aurignacian culture cave complexes was an attempt to interact with the ecological principles around them. Being admixed with Neanderthalensis, having the larger cerebellum that provided the ability for interim states of consciousness more easily, and subsequently communicated with the geist of nature in ways that really had never been done before. Auditing that, corroborating and collecting all the evidence for it would be the next project. And thank you for listening. That is all. That is Culture of the Cave Beasts.